Tonight, our exclusive Australian journalist Cheng Lei in her first interview since China's dictatorship freed her from 3 years in a jail cell where the light was always left on. Jailed on false charges she was leaking state secrets. This is a troubling insight into how brutal that regime is. Also tonight, the politicians now exploiting the terror in the Middle East to inflame race tensions here. Plus, I'll talk to the man likely to be New Zealand's new Deputy Prime Minister. He wants a referendum there too, will you believe it? But this time to reverse a treaty that divides New Zealand by race. But first, before I get on to the giant wah about the voice that we're seeing now and ask the question, is the Prime Minister now a puppet? A bizarre decision today, bizarre, by the Human Rights Commission. It's bullying by bureaucrats who can't even tell a man from a woman, yet is ordering the rest of us not to see that difference either. The Human Rights Commission has ordered the Lesbian Action Group not to ban men or transgender women from its events. Now, this group, led by Carol Ann, just wanted women like them to come to their party, lesbians, born women. Now, the first thing to say about this ban is, how dare they? I mean, how dare we have a so-called Human Rights Commission deny lesbians their human right to choose their own company, to choose who to invite to their own party? I just say, get out of our face. But the second thing is, are they nuts? The Human Rights Commission has actually ruled that men can be women. Your sex, apparently, is in your mind. It's not a biological concept at all. So now you are not free to have a lesbian-only party. You actually have to pretend as well that the men there, or actually people born male, are really women. Now, here's what the Commission said. It said that Parliament in 2013, during the Gillard Labor government, which got to all sorts of nonsense at the time, as you remember, it changed the definition of sex. And the Commission said the explanation given for the changed definition in the amendment's explanatory memorandum was that sex is not a binary concept and a person's sex can be changed. So sex is not what your X and your Y chromosomes say, it is what you think. So, for that stupid reason, lesbians will now party with men calling themselves lesbians because they like women too. I mean, how safe is that a spot for these lesbians? And if they break the law, if they say no, oh my goodness me. What a joke. Don't you wish that Big Brother government just got its foot off your throat? But to the fallout from the vote against The Voice on Saturday, the Prime Minister still is not getting the message. And some journalists, particularly on the ABC, are now calling no voters dumb or barely educated. And he's exploiting that too in a worrying way. Now, this giant tantrum is not just pathetic, it is dangerous. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese still can't accept that Australia said no to his whole agenda of racial separation. Now, 61% were against. Now, right, he does accept his voice is now dead, but he still won't promise to now scrap another key demand of the Uluru Statement that he promised to implement in full. It's this one, the Makarrata Commission, that is also spending money on, has already spent $500,000, to set up, to negotiate a treaty between Aborigines and the rest of us as if we're two warring people. A treaty about, sovereignty, for instance, and land, and of course, reparations. Well, here is the Prime Minister today, still toying with this racist and divisive agenda.
Will the Prime Minister be honest and upfront with Australians and inform the House whether or not he remains committed to a treaty and truth-telling process?
I will give respect to Indigenous Australians who have asked for a week to consider their position. I think that is pretty reasonable.
I can't believe what I'm hearing. Here is the Prime Minister still just doing the bidding of a bunch of Aboriginal radicals that sold him this stupid radical voice, wouldn't compromise. These guys, these radicals, are now off on their week of silence with their Aboriginal flags half-mast, a week of sulking And we don't even know who they are. These are unnamed Aboriginal activists, and the Prime Minister says, I can't move, I can't decide until they tell me what to do. I mean, seriously, have you ever heard of anything like that in your life? This is not leadership. This is not democracy. The guy is a puppet. Now, I'd say, Prime Minister, you've got to listen to the voters. Don't listen to these unnamed activists off in their sook. No to racial division. The public was very clear about that. But meanwhile, we have journalists just trying to blame the defeat of The Voice on all those stupid, uneducated people. Here's Walid Ali on Channel 10.
The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. So if you are in a seat that had high levels of tertiary education, a bachelor or postgrad, then you were at the very top end of the yes vote. And if you had the lowest levels of tertiary education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. And that's not to say people who are educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. It's about the style of the message, I think.
If you thought that was a bit arrogant and high-handed and all that, well, the ABC's Patricia Karvelis was even more explicit this morning. The uneducated really were to blame.
The yes vote, if you look at it, has been achieved in places where voters have a bachelor's degree or have better than average wages, and where you find educated people who know, if you've got a bachelor's degree, chances are you know something about government, our structures. You've taken an interest in the kind of way these things happen, not because you're better, but just because you've got the opportunity to have done that. Just to be clear, like, I'm not judging people's achievements. It's just you've been able to find out lots of information.
Looking at that electoral map, there's actually a much simpler explanation. The areas that voted for The Voice were exactly the rich urban bits where the voters were least likely to meet Aborigines, Sydney's North Shore, for instance, or Canberra. And the places that voted against were often the poorer and remoter bits where you were most likely to actually meet Aborigines and see for yourself whether A Voice would actually fix things, Northern Territory, for instance, and Cape York. It's a battle between ideology and observation one. People looking with their own eyes instead of dreaming like pink castles in rich urban areas. Now, it's exactly the same with global warming policies, by the way, same thing. Yeah, people in the cities in concrete going all green, people out in the countryside seeing these massive transition electricity wires and wind farms, they're against. But the other point about education, there is actually a saying that some things are so stupid that only intellectual could believe it. Communism, for instance, plenty of Marxists still in our universities. Eugenics, now the ludicrous idea that global warming could wipe out humans or that men can be women. Well, a much smarter analysis of this referendum is that people who have power, people who are rich or plugged into government and the media, living in their big mansions, they can risk giving one racial group a little of their power because they reckon they can survive whatever could go wrong with The Voice. They've got the ultimate power anyway. But people who are poor and really battling and they're on the margins of our cities or they're out bush and they're far away from all the levers of power and the media microphones, they haven't got any power to share. They're struggling to get ahead as it is. So don't go and tell them that some other group needs rights more than they do because, of their race. Won't work. But to this notion that stupid Australians voted against this Voice, people tricked by misinformation. Let that myth take hold and it could have really dangerous political consequences, particularly when you've got a government thinking we were robbed by misinformation. Because guess what? Straight away, one of the pro-Voice independents in Parliament was today demanding censorship.
Nothing protects voters from misleading and deceptive political advertising. Will you support my bill or introduce legislation without delay to provide voter protections in political advertising consistent with existing consumer protections?
I certainly understand her perspective because it is a concern with the changing media environment as well, that people can be the subject to misinformation.
Can you imagine what the Labor government, this Labor government and its bureaucratic allies could have done during the referendum campaign with the power to censor advertisements of the No campaign that they thought, misinformation. Joining me for Newswatch is Sophie Ellsworth, media writer for the Australian newspaper. Sophie, thanks for your time. But Waleed Ali, all right, he can say whatever nonsense he likes. It's Channel 10 about dumb voters. I wonder how intelligent his audience is. But Patricia Karvelas, she is from the taxpayer-funded ABC, and that is meant to be impartial, isn't it?
Well, you would think so, Andrew, particularly because at the start of the year, all ABC editorial staff had impartiality training when it comes to the Voice referendum. But, Andrew, I think these remarks by Waleed and Patricia Karvelas are really offensive to a majority of Australians who voted no. And they seem to be not able to come to terms with the fact that there was a resounding no vote in this country. People did not want this. And now it's come down to really, I think, quite insulting takeouts from this, that if you don't have a bachelor's degree or you haven't sat in a university lecture theatre, you're more likely not to be really engaged and sucked in to the misinformation, disinformation, the lies that were peddled supposedly by the No campaign. I think this is really offensive, Andrew. And just so the viewers can see, this is a grab that Patricia Karvelas had when she interviewed Warren Mundine on the night of the referendum.
There were many things that your campaign said that weren't true. Do you regret taking that approach?
I reject what you just said.
I mean, that's so offensive. Taking it as a fact that the No campaign had told lies and seriously, Patricia Karvelas, get over yourself. People voted against the Voice for very sound reasons. There was another meltdown on another of our publicly funded broadcasters, again meant to be neutral, impartial. This time it was former Olympian and politician Nova Peris on the SBS. Here she is.
Australia has pulled the shutters down and said, we choose not to see you, we choose not to hear you.
I mean, that's such an inflammatory message, Sophie, and so false. I mean, we have 11 Aboriginal MPs in Parliament. One of them is this Aboriginal woman, for instance, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who we listened to very carefully, the No campaign leader. But, spreading that message by some in the media that, isn't that really toxic, saying that this country is racist and heartless and this proves it?
It's pretty disgraceful stuff, Andrew. I mean, I was watching SBS on Saturday night and was nearly falling off my chair, seeing what was unfolding there with Marcia Langton described as a national treasure. Some of this stuff that went to air over on the ABC, I saw Laura Tingle ask one of the Indigenous MPs if, I'm paraphrasing here, if this resounding no vote meant that Australians didn't love Indigenous Australians. It was something to that effect. Do they feel like they are not loved? I think what was happening on Saturday night was the left knew this was going down and they prepared their talking points, and their talking points were that this was full of misinformation, disinformation and lies, and they are still struggling to come to terms with, Andrew, that Australians did not want this. And when they finally wake up and realise perhaps the mainstream media is completely offbeat here, they are not listening to what mainstream Australians believe, and that is they did not want this voice to Parliament.
That is exactly correct. It really is that simple. They looked at it and they didn't like it. They liked it a year ago. They didn't like it when they looked closer. Now, but if you really want a dangerous take on race politics here, Sophie, I was shocked to hear this from race-baiting Senator Lydia Thorpe. She was siding with the Palestinians, particularly with the Hamas-led Gaza Strip, Hamas being a terrorist group, after the slaughter and rape of Jews a week ago, and said Aborigines here had the same right to stand against colonialists, as she put it. Here she is.
Colonisation and dispossession is not a thing of the past you just read up in the history books. They are ongoing violent processes happening right now.
You have the responsibility to support Palestinians standing against it, just as you have the responsibility to support First Nations people here standing against it.
This is so inflammatory, Sophie. It's almost like, whipping up, accidentally or not, an intifada in our streets over the Aboriginal issue. I mean, this debate now is getting right out of hand.
Well, it is, Andrew, and if I remember correctly, Lydia Thorpe didn't go on Q&A last night because she said she was still receiving threats and she felt unsafe. Some of these comments that people in the public are making are pretty damn offensive, Andrew, and it just stirs up this angst and this whiplash, which is completely unnecessary. But Lydia Thorpe she's very outspoken, as we all know. She generates headlines. And sometimes I wonder if she's just saying these things, Andrew, to get a reaction, because then it ends up in the media and we all start talking about it.
I can't help but think you're absolutely correct there. I would hate to think she's actually wanting the war that she keeps talking about, because in the end, it won't just her be being frightened. Whether these threats are real or not, I don't know how genuine they are. A lot of people will be terrified, because that is the last thing you want. We should be talking it down, not talking it up, and that is a senator in our parliament. It's just extraordinary. Sophie Ellsworth, thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, our exclusive interview with the Australian journalist was finally freed last week by the Chinese dictatorship after 3 years in jail. The lights kept on day and night over fake claims that she was leaking national secrets. Cheng Lei on her ordeal is up next. Do not miss it. I'll tell you later something really bizarre about Qatar Airways. Hypocrisy. But to our exclusive interview with Cheng Lei. That's the Australian journalist who was jailed by China 3 years ago on fake charges of leaking national secrets. And then she was suddenly released last week ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to China. No coincidence there, I think. Joining me is Annalise Nielsen, our Sky News US correspondent. Annalise, lovely to see you again. You actually flew back to Australia to do this interview because you are a former colleague of Cheng Lei and you campaigned relentlessly on this show, for instance, to get her release. It was just fantastic what you did. How did you find her when you went to talk to her yesterday?
Look, she's remarkable. I think just after spending the time with her, I just kept thinking, I'm so glad we've got her back, because she is an extraordinary human and she's been through absolute hell, and it is so lovely to see her with her kids again, and I think she has an incredible story to tell. I don't want to tell too much of it for her, but I think I've worked with her partner, Nick, for the last few years doing advocacy for her case, and this is just all been so worth it to see this outcome come together. We're so proud of how she's handled it. And obviously a lot of it's quite emotional. There's some things she wasn't comfortable talking about yet. This is very fresh. She's only been out a week, but she does have an incredible story to tell.
Now, one thing that I've been picking up on what you've said before this interview about the interview, is there something that we should note about how she talks about it, her reflections on it, as we watch it? Because it seems that she was kept out of the loop about a lot of things that were going on.
I mean, she had half-hour consular visits once a month, and those weren't detailed updates about everything in the world. They were things like messages from her kids. I mean, I saw her passing messages back and forth, worried about her son's school enrolment. Can you imagine, in half an hour once a month? Those are the things that you're talking about. And so I think one thing we really need to keep into context here is she has just been out a few days. She's overwhelmed. She's talked about how there's just a shock of colours in the world after being in detention for so long, about getting back to noise and hugs and all those little things. But just to put into context too, for those who haven't been following her case, there's the first 6 months she spent in what's called residential surveillance at a designated location. And that sounds like it might not be that bad. That's that's kind of the worst case scenario. That's basically you're in isolation. You have full-time guards watching your every move. You don't get to go outside. You don't get to talk to people. And so things improved for her drastically after 6 months, when she was then moved to another secure facility, another detention-like facility. But that was the first time she had cellmates. And that's where her life improved somewhat. But throughout this process, she's never known when the end date would be. There was the constant pushback of the sentencing. And so for that whole time, she hasn't known, oh, if I just wait this out, if I just survive 4 months or whatever it is, then I'll be out. So this is where so much of the stress and anxiety for her has come. And now it was bizarre even going to do this interview with her, because I was thinking, well, from one aspect, I don't know what she's been through. And from the other, I know so much more than she knows, because we've been seeing what's happening outside. Yeah. We had all this information. So I do want people to keep that in mind.
And all that time, all that uncertainty, if she'd even get out, and what she was in there for. Well, here is Annalise's interview with Cheng Lei, the first that she's granted since China released her last week.
How are you feeling? I get asked that a lot, and it's always very hard to answer, because sometimes I feel like an invalid, like a newborn, and very fragile. And other times I feel like I could fly and I want to embrace everything, and I enjoy everything so intensely and savour it.
Talk me through sentencing. This kept getting kicked back of 3 months, yeah?
Yeah.
And then you were in court. What happened?
When the embassy guys told me that sentencing will be next week, my exact words were, about bloody time. Handcuffed, shackled, feet shackled, into the court van, get to the court. So this was 7 a.m, so a boring wait until the 9:30 sentencing time, during which time I had to go to the toilet. And I'm, led down the corridor to go to a normal toilet, a sit-down toilet. And that was the first time I had sat on a toilet in over 3 years.
Wow.
And I relished the experience. I come out, there's a mirror. Again, the first time in over 3 years. With all the white hairs, I have just dyed my hair, by the way. And the dark eye pouches, I hadn't slept the night before, and wrinkles and whatnot. And looking really pale and frail, I felt.
So you get to the airport. Who's the first person you see? Is it Penny Wong, or is it your kids?
It's my kids running at me, and my mum, who has aged a lot in the past 3 years. And we just all screamed, and my mum wept, and I just held on to it, and I could see that she had lost a lot of weight because of diabetes and having broken her ribs, and just having to shoulder the burden mentally and physically, and just be strong for me all that time. My heart broke.
Okay, so you get to Melbourne.
Yeah.
What's the first meal you went out for in Melbourne?
Vietnamese.
Yeah?
Because my mum lives in a very Asian neighbourhood.
Yeah.
And we just walked to this little place and had pho, had chicken feet.
Wow. Chicken feet?
Well, they had Chinese food as well. Cantonese
that
food
would
as
not
well.
have been on my list for first meals.
Well, it was more because my kids and my mum as well. But then the next day, I gorged myself at the Vic Market, the temple of good eating.
Yeah.
And had bratwurst, had borek, then hot chocolate to wash it down, bought Moreton Bay bugs, Sydney rock oysters, and what else? What didn't I buy?
Lei only heard snippets of the campaign being waged on her behalf in Australia.
We're all dealing with the coronavirus crisis at the time. Her kids were bound in Melbourne and stuck and couldn't get them back.
Now that you ask, I remember, you asked what was the first meal you had.
Yeah.
More importantly, what was the first alcoholic drink you had?
Actually, very true. What was it?
It was Brown Brothers Patricia Champagne, and it was fantastic.
Oh, I love that. We will get you another bottle.
And I didn't get emo drunk at all.
That's impressive.
Slightly.
This is the question everyone wants to know.
Sure.
What were you actually accused of? And if I'll read out to you what was released by the Ministry of State Security after your sentencing.
Yep.
They said you were charged with illegally providing China's state security secrets abroad, and that you illegally provided China's state secrets that you had known at work through your mobile phone, and you were found to have been co-opted by an overseas institution. What did you do?
Well, you and I are both, well, I was in the business of telling people things. So you can imagine how much I have wanted to tell my story, because I know this is what everyone is curious about. But I'm also conscious of the fact, or I'm given to understand, that I can't really divulge details or specifics.
Okay.
And every country, I guess, different countries have different systems. One does what one has to do in that sort of situation. And my focus was getting home to my family in one piece.
I think I know, because we spoke yesterday.
Yes.
We kind of debriefed about your situation and what happened. I think that what you did was just a really minor thing, and you spent 3 years in a situation where you're deprived of information and you've been told that you did something wrong, and you kind of internalized that a little. Like, this is my opinion, and I worry that you actually hold guilt around something that you've done, which was incredibly basic. So they've said you shared a document. I mean, we're talking about a government briefing before you went on air, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and essentially you broke an embargo.
Yes.
By a few minutes.
Yes.
And that's the accusation against you.
Yes.
I mean, when I heard that, I gasped, because I've done that. I don't think there's a journalist alive who hasn't done that. Embargoes barely work in Australia because no one ever adheres to them, but it's a pretty normal part of media briefings. Do you actually feel like you did something wrong?
Well, the aim of RSDL and all the subsequent talks and writing self-assessments, I think, is to drive home that point, that in China that is a big sin.
Yeah.
That you have hurt the motherland, and that state's authority has been eroded because of you. And I mean, what seems innocuous to us here is, and I mean, I'm sure it's not limited to embargoes, but many other things are not in China. Especially, I'm given to understand that the gambit of state security is widening.
Yeah. So were you arrested? Did they just come in the night to your apartment? Was that how it happened?
No. They had people from my work, someone very senior, call me and say, "You're wanted here for a very important meeting about your new ambassador series."
Wow.
Yeah.
Your work.
So
wow.
I went in thinking about work.
Yeah.
And I get to this big meeting room, and about 20 people there.
Yeah.
And then someone stands up, shows his badge, and says, "You're wanted for." And immediately they take my belongings away, and then I'm led to, or escorted to my apartment, where they'd already arranged with the security at my compound to go through the garage up to my apartment, where they looked for evidence all day.
Yeah, so when did you realise you were really in serious trouble?
They tried to give me hints at the apartment as we were leaving. They said, turn off the power and water, take some clothes, and take some toiletries. And I said, oh, it'll be right. I've left my apartment for a few weeks and no problems.
Yeah. Oh boy.
And they said, you sure you don't want something to eat? So I made myself a homemade bread toasted sandwich with cheese and avocado. And those three things I ended up not having for over 3 years.
Oh, wow. And you had no idea that was your last free meal?
No. Or if I'd known, I would have had more.
Lei would go from her job as a global news anchor to 6 months of what's called residential detention.
It's to make you feel isolated and bored and pained and desperate. My experience was the first 5 months I got to read books and I had a pen and paper with which to write, and that was much less painful than the final month of just 12 hours a day of pure sitting and very little chance to get up and just walk, just pace around the very little room.
Because you weren't allowed outside in that time at all?
No way.
So 5 months without seeing...
6 months in total.
6 months.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they say that they gave me 15 minutes of fresh air, but all it meant was there's a window up the top that the guard would open for 15 minutes, but the curtains are still drawn while the windows are open. And I certainly didn't feel there was fresh air.
Yeah.
And you never saw anything except the blue curtains and the mottled carpet and the beige padded walls.
And it was just silence?
Silence, yeah.
What were the nightmares? Can you describe them for me?
Every dream was a nightmare, because waking up, if it was a good dream, waking up was worse. And if it was a bad dream, then obviously you were frightened. So I had recurring dreams about my children with me on the bus, who were still little, and there was no car seat, and I couldn't help them when there was an accident. I had dreams about trying to reach Nick on the phone, and the phone would be taken away, or I would scroll and I couldn't find his name, or I'd ring and he wouldn't be there. Or I'd dream that I was outside and waking up to see the guards' faces was the worst. So when you were either trying to sleep and trying to block all those thoughts that you didn't want to go near in your head, and then when you slept, it was worse. Yeah. So I would translate poems in my head, or try to think of questions to ask. Why do things work a certain way? I would try to have internal conversations with Nick. What would Nick say? How would he make this into a joke?
Yeah.
I even made up a radio station called Coffin FM, because that's what it felt like. We were buried alive, and I would be sending or pretending to be different people and sending each other love song dedications. Yeah, I listened to a lot of I used to listen to a lot of radio.
Yeah.
And I still miss it very much.
Yeah. Well, you got it back now.
Yeah. And one of the first songs I heard in the car on the radio was Boys of Summer.
Yeah.
And I told Nick, if there was a nuclear holocaust, there'd still be some Australian radio station playing Boys of Summer. And
that is a fact, yeah.
Yeah.
After residential detention, she was transferred to a separate facility where she'd have cellmates. They never turned the lights off?
No, neither in the detention centre. So it was, and even at the halfway house, the lights were on.
You're joking.
No.
Wasn't the halfway... Oh, sorry, yeah.
So on the plane,
Yeah.
it was the first time I'd experienced darkness at night.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And of course now, here, in a normal bed, in a normal house, I can turn the lights off. Bliss.
Wow. And you were teaching yourself languages in there?
Yes, because I'd done German in high school, and I improved my Cantonese with my cellmate. I also tried to learn by myself Italian and Spanish and a wee bit of Japanese. I built up a stash of over 200 books, and I used to think, wow, this is a book that Nick has lovingly chosen for me and has held in his hand, and I would just caress the book and keep it close to me, and when I could, I would put it under my pillow because it was so comforting. And when there were wise words or encouraging words, I would feel that he had written them, along with very corny song lyrics. I would pretend that he was singing them to me. Maybe not Celine Dion.
Wasn't it Celine Dion? What was the Celine Dion story you were telling me about the song?
Yeah. There's a song, Because You Loved Me. Yeah. And in it there are two lines that get me every time. One is, for all the wrongs that you made right. And another one is, just makes me think about everyone who's helped me, is you were my voice when I couldn't speak, because no one has a voice, and all your voice is quashed. So,
how did you feel about how the Australian government was handling the case? Did you notice when there was a change in government how your situation was handled?
I certainly felt there was more engagement, and even at the consular visits, noticeable increase in energy, and just the amount of things that were being done, and I just can't begin to thank them. DFAT and the PM and the media and just ordinary people with heart.
And Penny Wong.
She's amazing. I'd met her in 2014 at a dinner, and she was really impressive. So I passed on a message to her because I heard about the tweets that she was sending and all the heartfelt messages, and contacting my family and reassuring them. And she actually wrote me a personal message back, and it wasn't just poly speak or, standard stock phrases. I really felt that she was a friend who was trying to help me, trying to look out for my best interests.
Now Lei has fresh air and freedom, but adjusting back to normal life won't be without its own challenges.
Because of this whole ordeal, I keep expecting, people to drop out of the sky and arrest me. And maybe it's something I need to get over, that it doesn't happen here.
It's going to take some time.
Or, something will happen to my children, or something of mine will get taken away.
So what now?
I have to make up for, absent mummy for the next few years, I think. But when they're at school, I'd love to put down my thoughts. I'd love to cook all the new recipes I'd been interested in.
Yeah.
Travel, embrace nature, start a garden. Just every time I look at the sky, I can't believe I can look, it's 360-degree view as opposed to just a little slit up the top of the cell.
Did you do the school run last week?
I did.
Yeah? What was that like?
Felt so good. Yeah. I saw one of my son's friends call out to him as he came, and I saw the lollipop man, who was very friendly, and just this whole idea that I am now here for them, and meeting my daughter's teachers, who were so sweet. Yeah. They had been praying for me, and I even met one of the teacher's dogs who my daughter had written about in her letters, because they were, family letters are like medication. Yeah. And when you get them, it's a huge boost to the immune system, to everything. Yeah. And when you don't, or when you get them really late, you feel like a patient who needs to go to dialysis and is missing that treatment. So they are so important to people who are detained. I was euphoric when I spoke to the embassy guys and just thanking them and wanting to sing, because words really fail the amount of gratitude I feel for everyone who has believed me and supported me. You know, I work with words and I trust words, but words are useless.
What did you sing when you said you sang for joy? Was there a particular song, or was it just...
I said I feel like one phrase perhaps says it better, which is in the first verse of Amazing Grace. It's a song that's very special because it helped me and my cellmates a lot. We may not have the best voices, but when we were softly singing, because singing is actually against the rules and you want to be careful not to be heard, but that song just soothes so much and gives you hope and courage.
Terrific interview. We've got to remember Cheng Lei was essentially kept as a hostage to hold over Australia, released in time to keep the Prime Minister's suite for his visit to Beijing. Shocking. And don't forget, there's another Australian who's now served 4 years in jail on essentially trumped up charges, it seems. Yang Hengjun is a writer. And let us not forget Ilan Tohti, who's a Uyghur university lecturer. He's 9 years now into a life sentence for criticising China's policies towards Uyghurs. What a country that is. After the break, I'll show you the faces of the politicians who yesterday said Israel can't defend itself, cannot defend itself even from baby-killing terrorists and kidnappers. Never forget what they've just said and remember their names when I show them to you. Plus another Islamist terror attack, this time in Europe, with soccer fans gunned down. I have to now call out some politicians who have disgraced themselves, our parliament and our country. And they've made it look to many overseas like, well, Australia really does hate Jews. Shameful. These are politicians who tried yesterday to stop Parliament from passing a motion saying Israel had the right to defend itself, and tried to stop Parliament from saying we stood with Israel after Islamist terrorists slaughtered 1,400 Jews, beheading or burning to death even babies, taking hostages. And they demanded that Parliament instead declare Israel the war criminal. I mean, these are appalling people. We're talking here about Greens leader Adam Bandt and his fellow Greens in the lower house who all voted for this, along with Teal Independent Sophie Scamps, Teal Independent Kalia Tink, and Independent Andrew Wilkie, all saying Israel cannot defend itself even against terrorists who burn families and children alive. Remember those people and never forget where they stood when Jews were slaughtered. Now that said, I mean, I totally get it. People are also worried about the innocents in Gaza who are also now getting killed as Israel strikes back against Hamas, the terrorist group which runs that territory. But I also know that while I want every innocent life spared, this is exactly Hamas's sick game. To commit horror attacks, deliberately to force Israel to fight back, but then to make sure their own civilians are huddled around, packed around the Hamas military assets, so they can then point to the bodies and say, see, Israelis are the real villains. We're the victims. It's an awful dilemma, and it's become a burning hot issue in the West because of all the Muslim immigrants who have moved there. In Brussels last night, a jihadist shot dead 2 Swedish soccer fans. Last week, another killed a teacher in France. And in London, there have been massive demonstrations against Israel, with many of the protesters of immigrant backgrounds, Muslims in particular. Joining me from London is writer and commentator Esther Kraku. Esther, thank you so much for your time. I know you're conflicted on this as well, and finding it hard to deal with. Let's first talk about Belgium. It suffered so many terrorist attacks already from jihadists, now another, France as well, and with war in Gaza about to get red hot, Europe must feel like it's sitting on a volcano.
It does. And I mean, you know, we're seeing isolated incidents of Islamist terrorists effectively attacking individuals across Europe. I mean, even here in Britain, counter-terrorism police in northeast England have just arrested a man for the murder and attempted murder of two people in Hartlepool in the north of England. We obviously know about the attacks in France, which left a teacher dead. Now in Brussels, we saw two Swedish football fans shot and another person injured. And I suspect we're not going to see the end of this. Obviously, you know, Hamas leadership called for a day of jihad, and we're seeing that. I mean, in London, I think the most telling thing was the pro-Palestinian protest, where over 40,000 people gathered in London. Now, there are people that are genuinely concerned about the plight of Palestinians. I am one of them, and I think that there is a very legitimate cause there. But at these protests, the pro-Palestinian protests in London, you saw people, supporting Hamas, saying from river to sea, Palestine will be free, which is actually, something that is said to indicate the complete wipeout of the state of Israel. You know, you had people actually saying that Hamas are not terrorists and that they're freedom fighters, even though they're known to hide behind women and children. They're known to hide rockets in hospitals, behind and inside people's homes. They've been telling people not to evacuate northern Gaza because they want as many civilian casualties as possible. So it's a completely devastating situation. But one thing that is clear is there will be no peace. There will be no advancement of peace if we keep treating Hamas like with kid gloves, like they're sort of the resistance fighters that are just fighting for the rights of Palestinians. Actually, we'll see no progress. They're murdering their own civilians in this process, and we need to take that seriously. A group of people that shoots civilians, that targets civilians and shoots them, murders women and children, they cannot be taken seriously. And in some sense, you can understand the preoccupation of people on both sides. I mean, Israel has the right to defend itself, but Palestinians do have the right to safety and to a state. I mean, I would often say that the Palestinians have unfortunately been governed so terribly. I mean, even in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while his people, the GDP per capita is literally a pittance amongst Palestinians in the West Bank. And in Gaza, the leadership there are using their own citizens as human shields. So it's a really horrible, devastating situation, and we're obviously calling for restraints on both sides. But I think what's been disgraceful has been, people in the West in particular trying to equate Hamas as some sort of, freedom fighting group or trying to humanize them in some way. In the case of Europe, we're seeing, extremists that are known to intelligence agencies, particularly in France, for instance, rearing their ugly heads. And there are genuine questions about immigration into Europe, the kinds of values that people are bringing over into Europe, and what this means for social cohesion, both in Britain, which is actually one of the most successful examples of multiculturalism in the world. You have France, you have Belgium, you have Germany, you have Sweden. These are genuine questions that are being asked, and I fear for the future.
Oh, so do I, Esther, so do I. I mean, this is the thing about the attack Hamas launched. How can Israel drop the borders now? Let the Gaza people go free when they know that strolling across the border will do people who've just done what they've just done to Israelis a week ago. Esther Krakow, it's a terrible, terrible dilemma. Thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, I've got to tell you, there is some hypocrisy. I see the flight now coming in, bringing Jews back from Israel. Well, there's something to be said about the airline that took them after this. Now, the first chartered flight taking people from Israel, well, actually, they picked them up in Dubai. The RAAF flew them to Dubai. 222 people has landed now in Sydney, taking them back to safety. They were flown home free by Qatar Airways. It's been banned, of course, from those extra flights in Australia. So this is great publicity for them. Very nice. Except for this, it's something you need to know about Qatar. Qatar Airlines is owned by the government of Qatar, which gives a home, a sanctuary, a hideout to the heads of Hamas, the terrorist group which actually ordered that onslaught on Israel, killing all those Jews just for being Jews, those civilians, burning alive babies and things like that. They actually harbour the terrorists who caused this whole catastrophe that Qatar Airways now helps rescue people from. I don't know whether to thank them or despise them. And by the way, you might notice that the onslaught, the Israeli reaction, is now 3 days delayed. I think they realise that Hamas is better prepared than they ever expected and may be walking into a trap. Whether they'll get then attacked from the north, Hezbollah, or Iran's now threatened to attack them, this could turn out to be a very big war. President Biden is going over to show support this week, but I tell you what, the world is on the brink. That's it from me. Coming up next is Chris Kenny. From me, though, good night.